So we are on Daf Lamed Zayin, 11 lines from the top. We basically introduced yesterday a fundamental machloket, fundamental argument in terms of understanding our Mishnah, and the basic argument goes like this: that according to one view, you can leave a pot or water or whatever it is over an open flame. Basically, you don't need to cover it with ashes. You don't need to sweep out the coals. But if you want to remove something from the flame and put it back on Shabbat, now you need to cover it. It needs to be covered in order to do that. The other opinion said that no, even to leave something over the fire requires some covering over the flame or over the coals beforehand. So this basic machloket is what's going back and forth. The Chachamim say that you need a covering. You need to put ashes over the coals. You need to sweep out the coals, even if you just want to leave something sitting over the flame. And Hananya. The concern is that it's that you might come to play with it on purpose. You know, you'll forget and you'll go and play with the coals. So the Chachamim say that you can't even leave anything over the fire. Hananya is the one that says that to leave something over the flame, as long as it's partially cooked, as long as it's edible, that's okay. But to return something, in other words, to take something off on Shabbat and put it back, there you definitely needs to be covered according to everyone. So that's what the machloket is here. So so now we said Amar Rabbi Chilbo. So Tashma, come and listen. That's what we're on line 11. Tashma, come and listen. Amar Rabbi Chilbo, Amar Rabbi Chama bar Gurya. Rabbi Chilbo said that Rabbi Chama bar Gurya said, Amar Rav, that Rav said, Lo shanu ela al gaba, aval letocha asur. That when he doesn't say exactly what he's referring to, but he says we didn't learn this except with regard to putting it on top of the kira, on top of the stove, but inside the stove. In other words, remember that the way the stoves were constructed was you actually kind of like lowered the pot into the stove. It was a cavity, the stove. You lowered it in. So he said, putting it inside, you're not allowed to do. Putting it on top. In other words, if you imagine that the stove is a square and it has an edge to it, and you put the pot on that edge, that's okay. But to put it inside the opening, if you think of it as a box, to put it inside the opening, that you're not allowed to do. So what is he referring to? That's the question. He doesn't say what case. Is he referring to leaving it over the flame, that you can't even leave it over the flame if it's inside the stove? Or does he mean that you can't return it to inside the stove? That's going to be the question. So the Gemara says as follows. If you assume that what we're talking about in the Mishnah is lahachzir tenan, which means you can leave a pot over the flame even without any kind of a covering of the ashes, but you can't return a pot to the flame on Shabbat unless it's covered, so then hainu d'shaneh ben tocha le'al gaba. So then it makes perfect sense why there would be a distinction between putting the pot into the stove and putting it on the edge of the stove. In other words, on the lip of the stove, so to speak. Why is there a difference? Because if we're talking about leaving it over an uncovered flame, so there's a huge difference if the flame is totally uncovered, whether it's inside that cavity or it's on the edge. Because if it's inside the cavity, it's actually resting right on hot coals. But if you're going to say that the Mishnah is assuming that even to leave something over the flame, it has to be covered. So mali tocha mali al gaba, what is the difference whether you put it inside, whether you leave it inside, or you leave it on the edge? In both cases, it's not directly on coals. So what's the difference? So therefore, what does that seem to support? That seems to support the theory that you're allowed to leave pot over an open flame, because that's why it's making a distinction between whether it's al gaba, whether it's on the lip of the stove, or whether it's litocha, which is actually inside that cavity. But then the Gemara says, Misavrat Rabbi Chilbo Areshaka. Maybe Rabbi Chilbo is not talking about the beginning of the Mishnah. Maybe Rabbi Chilbo will agree that actually you can't leave a pot over the stove, even to leave it over it requires it to be covered. But Asefaka, he's talking about the end. That when Beit Hillel said when you could return the pot, that was where he qualified. In other words, he agrees perhaps that in order to leave a pot over the flame, it has to be covered. Even to leave it over the flame has to be covered. even from before Shabbat. To return it, everybody agrees that it has to be covered. And he's saying that even then, even though it's covered, when you return it on Shabbat, you cannot return it to the inside of where the pot normally rests. In other words, into that cavity. It has to only be on the lip. It has to be next to the flame, not right over the flame, we would say, like the hot spot of the blech type of idea, right? It can't be right on top of the flame. Now, so therefore we cannot conclude anything from here, basically, is the answer. So now, Tashma, come in here, another attempted proof. What are we trying to prove? We're trying to prove whether our Mishnah is allowing us to leave a pot over an uncovered flame before Shabbat, and it's only prohibiting us to return it unless it's covered, or if our Mishnah is saying that even to leave a pot over the flame from before Shabbat, it must be covered. That's the question. So Tashma, come and listen. Bet kirot, so if you have two kirot, hamatimot, that are right next to each other, instead of having just one of these stoves, and again, these stoves open from the top, the flame is on the bottom, and you put the pot in, there are two next to each other. It's like a double stove.
There's a kir in between, no?
There's a wall in between the two. So there, achad grufa uktuma ve'achad she'ena grufa. So one of them you prepared. You either covered the ashes or you swept them out. The other one, the fire is live in there, but you're not going to use that one. So mashin al gabe grufa uktuma, then mashin al she'ena grufa ve'ena ktuma. You're not allowed to use the one that hasn't had the coals covered. But what does it say? Mashin. Okay? Leaving the pot on it from before Shabbat. So what does this seem to support? It seems to support the Chachamim, who say that even to leave food over the stove, the ashes need to be covered. Okay? But you can't use the one that's uncovered. You can only use the side that is covered. Now the Tosefta goes on and says, Vein mashin, umahin mashin. What can you leave over the stove? Beit Shammai omrim v'lo klum. Beit Shammai says nothing. So their answer, they don't agree with this at all. According to this version, Beit Shammai holds you can never leave anything over the flame, even if it's covered, no matter what. Beit Hillel omrim chamina v'lo tavshil.
What's there?
Right, just water, hot water, that's it according to this version. Akar, if you took it off, divrei akol lo yachzir, divrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir has a stricter version of Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel than what we had in our Mishnah. According to Rabbi Meir's version, you're never allowed to return a pot to the flame even if it's covered, ever. And even if the ashes even if the coals are covered with ashes, you can only leave hot water on it, according to Beit Hillel, and according to Beit Shammai, you can't leave anything. So basically, according to Rabbi Meir, everybody agrees you can never leave food over the fire, even if it's covered, and you can never return anything to the fire, even if it's covered. The only machloket, according to Rabbi Meir, is can you leave hot water over a covered flame, where Beit Shammai says no and Beit Hillel says yes. That's a very restrictive view. Rabbi Yehuda says no. Beit Shammai omrim chamin v'lo tavshil, Beit Hillel omrim chamin v'tavshil. Beit Shammai omrim notinu v'lo machzirin, Beit Hillel omrim ach machzirin. That sounds exactly like our Mishnah. That according to Beit Shammai you can leave hot water but nothing else, and according to Beit Hillel you can leave any food. And according to Beit Hillel, if you took it off on Shabbat, you can return it. And according to Beit Shammai, you can't. That's like exactly what it says in our Mishnah. So, but what is the point here? The point is that so if we assume that our Mishnah is saying that one must have a covered flame, even in order to be able to leave food over the flame, it has to be covered. So then, matnitin mani Rabbi Yehudahi. Then our Mishnah is following Rabbi Yehuda's version here, because Rabbi Yehuda's version is if you want to leave food over the flame, it has to be covered. What can you leave? Anything you want. If you remove it, you can put it back according to Beit Hillel. But if you're going to say that our Mishnah is actually permitting you to leave food even over an uncovered flame, and it only prohibits you, it only limits you when you want to return food on Shabbat, but to leave it, it's okay. So matnitin mani. Our Mishnah then doesn't follow either of these. Lo Rabbi Yehuda, lo Rabbi Meir, because it doesn't follow either one. Why? Because because if we're going to say that our Mishnah follows Rabbi Meir, there's a contradiction between our Mishnah and Rabbi Meir on two counts. Because according to he says Beit Shammai says you can't do anything, right? Our Mishnah says that Beit Shammai says you can at least have hot water over the flame on Shabbat. You can leave it over the flame on Shabbat. And our Mishnah is saying, according to Rabbi Meir, he's saying you can't do anything, and ours says that you can leave hot water over the flame on Shabbat. So that's one problem with Beit Shammai. And Beit Hillel betarte, because according to Rabbi Meir, you can only leave hot water according to Beit Hillel, and you can never return anything. And our Mishnah disagrees with both of these. Our Mishnah says that Beit Hillel says you can leave anything you want and that you can return things to it. So clearly our Mishnah does not follow Rabbi Meir's version, Rabbi Yehuda, but even Rabbi Yehuda's version. Kashya grufa uktuma, because in this Tosefta, Rabbi Yehuda says, true, it matches up with our Mishnah and everything else, because his version of Beit Hillel is that you can leave whatever you want over the fire, and that's what our Mishnah says. His version of Beit Hillel says that you can return things that you took off, and so does our Mishnah. But this Tosefta says that you can only leave things over the flame if the flame is covered. And you're telling me, Hananya, that our Mishnah says that you're allowed to leave things over an uncovered flame if you leave them from before. So, no, really, Hananya can still defend himself. Why? Because no problem. Our Mishnah is a third opinion. It's not Rabbi Yehuda and it's not Rabbi Meir, because Rabbi Yehuda b'chada b'chamin v'tavshil v'notin u'machzirin u'paliga le'b'chada ilu tanadidan savar lashot v'afal pishin o garuf v'katum v'Rabbi Yehuda savar b'lashot nami garuf v'katum in ilo lower in the widest lines. So what the point is that according to this version, our Mishnah is a third view. It agrees with Rabbi Yehuda on how he frames the argument between the Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. That Beit Hillel allows you to leave whatever you want. Beit Shammai only allows you to leave hot water. And Beit Shammai says you can't return things that you remove from the flame, and Beit Hillel says you can. But our Mishnah argues with Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says that you can only leave things over a flame that's covered from before. And our Mishnah is saying, according to Hananya, that you can leave things over an open flame if you left them from before Shabbat. So therefore our Mishnah is arguing with Rabbi Yehuda on that point. By the way, they asked the following question. What is the din? What is the law? Can you lean? Remember, these stoves, so they're not like our stoves that have a flat top. So they have a wall. It's like a box. Okay? So you have to think, can you put food against the outer wall? You're not going to put it on top of the edge, and you're not going to put it inside, but next to the outer wall, like here. Okay? So can you do that if you didn't cover over the ashes, cover over the coals with ashes? So do we say that the only thing that's prohibited is putting it inside or putting it on top, but putting it next to it is okay, or is there no difference? So Tashma, come and listen. So where's the proof? Well, when we have two stovetops, right? When we have the double stovetop that's separated by a wall in between, so you have there's one cavity for a pot, and there's another cavity for a pot, and there's a wall between the two cavities, and one of them you cleaned out the coals, or you covered them, and one of them it's not cleaned out, it's hot coals. So it says you can use the one that's covered, but you can't use the one that's uncovered. So how could that be? Aren't you basically, by using the one that's covered, you're still benefiting from the heat from the wall of the one that's uncovered, aren't you? Because the one that's uncovered is right next to it, and they share a wall. And that means that your pot, which is in opening number 1, is still kind of leaning against the wall of opening number 2 that has the live coals. So clearly, lismoch, to lean against the outer wall, should be okay. So the Gemara says, no, there's a difference, because when you take a pot and you lean it against the outside wall of the stove, it's completely flush with the outside wall of the stove. Here, it's not completely flush with the wall. There's air in between. There's airspace in between the wall of the pot and the wall of the kira, the wall of the oven, and your pot. Your pot is somewhat suspended. It's not completely inside and against the wall of the stove. It's sort of like on a tripod type of thing over these coals. So it is benefiting perhaps from the heat of the adjacent stove, but it's not fully leaning against it. So you can't prove anything from that, because it could be that fully leaning against it wouldn't be allowed.
Can we? Or
we're going to see at the end. It's going to tell us. So we always have to be patient with the twisting and turning. Tashma, so now, come and listen. Amar Rav Safra. Rav Safra said that Rav Chia said, Kitama v'nitlabeta sumachin la umekaymin alea v'notnin mimena umachzirin la. So what do you see from that? It says, if you covered the coals, but then they reignited. Okay, so you thought you quieted them down by covering it, but they reignited again. So then it says, no problem. Still, you can lean a pot against the outside wall. You can leave a pot on there, you can take it off, and you can even return it there on Shabbat. No problem. So it's Shema Mina lismoch nami kitama'in lo kitamalo. What does it sound like? Okay, it sounds like you needed to cover, because what is he saying? He's saying if you covered it and then it reignited, we still treat it as if it's covered, since you covered it. So what do you see from that? You need covering in order to lean something against the wall, because it says you can still lean a pot against the wall of the oven, against the wall of the stove, of the kirah, since you covered it with ashes. Even though they re-flared up, it doesn't matter. You can still lean it against the outside wall. So what does that imply? That implies that if you hadn't covered it at all, you wouldn't have been allowed to lean it against the outside wall. But then again, the Gemara says, really, everything on that list of things you're allowed to do is something that requires ashes covering the coals? It also said you can remove a pot from that stove. Does removing a pot from the stove require that it be covered with ashes? No. Rather, it's a stylistic thing. Just like it says notlin, you can take from the stove because it wanted to illustrate that you could return. So too, it says you can lean it against the outside wall because it wanted to mention mekaymin, that you can leave a pot on the stove. So what does that mean? It means that we can't learn anything from it, because it could very well be that even if the coals were uncovered, you could lean something against the outside wall. It's just that it's giving all the examples of things that you do with a stove to say that you can treat it, even though the coals flared up again, you can still treat it as if it's covered. But not that everything on that list requires covered coals. So then the Gemara says, wait a second. Hachi hashta, that's not a good way out of it, because hatam notninu machzirin bechad makomo. Because when we say you can take a pot off the flame and you can return it to the flame, that makes sense that you would mention both of those things because they're related. You take off and you put back in the same place. But wait a second. But when it comes to somchin alahacha, somachin bechad makomu, or mekaymin bechad makomu. But leaning is against the outside wall. Leaving it over the flame is inside the stove. So why would you mention leaning against the outside wall? Because you're going to mention leaving it in the inside. They're not related. You can't say stylistically we had to mention that. It doesn't follow. It's not connected. So what's the final decision? Tashmakam, listen. It says that if you heated up a stove with gefet and etzim, these are the fuels that make coal, you can lean a pot against the outside wall. But you cannot leave something over the flame unless it is either you've swept out the coals or you've covered them. If you have coals that have died down, or you put the cards, the refuse that you clean out of flax, when you comb the flax, they would use that to put it over the coals. The fine byproduct, I guess you could say, of the flax. So that's considered ketuma, that's considered covered. So what do you see from that, though? That it said that you don't need to cover in order to lean it against the outside wall. You don't need to have the flame covered. Because when did it mention covering the flame? Only when it wanted to talk about leaving something inside the stove. But next to the wall, even though there are coals raging inside, we're not concerned about leaning it against the outside wall. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak bar Nachmani, Amar Rav Oshaya. Yitzchak bar Nachmani said that Rav Oshaya said, Kitama v'huvara mashina le'achamin shuchamu kol tzorkan v'tavshil shebishel kol tzorko. It says that if you covered over your coals with ashes, and then they became on fire again, v'huvara, it means it came back. The fire flared up again. You can still leave hot water that's already hot over that flame, and you can leave a cooked dish that has bishel kol tzorko, that is completely cooked. You can leave it over that flame. As we turn to Amud Bet, Shema Mina Mitztemek V'Yafel Lo Mutar. What do you see from that? He doesn't make any distinction between a cooked dish which is completely cooked and becomes worse as it cooks more, and a cooked dish that becomes better. Because there's two things. There's Mitztemek V'Yafel Lo means that the longer it cooks, the better it is. Like a chalent, like a dafina, a chamin. The longer you cook it, the better, the more flavorful it is. Nobody says, oh, don't overcook it. It could become better. And not burning it. We mean like simmering, stewing it. It becomes better. Whereas there are some foods that if you cook them too long, let's say chicken, for example, if you cook it too long, it dries out. It becomes, or steak or something, chicken, it will be ruined. So we don't want that to happen. So mitzamek v'yafelo means that the more you cook it, the better it gets. Mitzamek v'ralo means the more you cook it, the worse it gets. So therefore, if you have mitzamek v'yafelo, we're concerned, even when it's fully cooked, one might say, we should be concerned that you might stoke the coals, because you want it to be even better. Mitzamek v'ralo, if you know that by cooking it, by overcooking it, you're going to ruin it, you're going to be hesitant to stoke the coals anyway. So what is the Gemara saying? The Gemara is saying is that if the coals are covered, you might think to yourself, and what did we say? We said that you can leave something that's fully cooked. You might think that only something that's fully cooked and becomes worse, because something that's fully cooked and becomes better, maybe we should still be concerned that the person's going to stoke the coals. So it says, you see from here that we're not concerned about that. We say that even something which becomes better with further cooking, you can leave over the stove. The Gemara says, Shanehacha diktama. That's not true, because in this case we're talking about a case where you covered the coals. That's why you're allowed to leave something which is fully cooked over this flame, even though it becomes better. But that doesn't necessarily mean that if the flame were uncovered, you'd be allowed to leave something that becomes better over the flame. So why do we need this case at all? Don't we already know that you're not allowed to leave something over an open flame according to the Chachamim? Answer is hovara itztrichale. Ma'udete makevan to hovara hadra la lemilta kamaita kamashmalan. What is the reason why the Gemara needed to bring this case? Not because of the situation where the person leaves something over an open flame. There we know you're not allowed to leave food over an open flame according to the Chachamim. And even if it's already cooked, if it's going to be improved with further cooking, you can't leave it over an open flame. So why did that statement, what chidush, what novelty comes from the statement of Rabbi Yitzchak bar Nachmani then about the covered coals and leaving a fully cooked dish over them? The answer is that since that is a case where you covered the coals and they reignited, so you might have thought that when they reignite, they're considered now as if you didn't cover them. And therefore you wouldn't be allowed to leave anything over the open flame because the flame is as if it was never covered. So the answer is that once you cover it, and you've shown by covering it that you're not interested in stoking the coals, that's why you're allowed to leave a food that is fully cooked over that flame. Even if the coals reignite, we don't care, because you showed by covering the coals that you don't want that. That you don't want to play with the fire. Okay, so now the Gemara says, Amar Rabba Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Bar Chana said that Rabbi Yochanan said, Kitamav uvara mashin alei chamin shehu chumul kol tzorchan v'tafshil shebishal kol tzorkov afilu gechalim shel rotem. So again, what do we see? That if you have a stove that you covered the coals with ashes, you can leave over it water, and then that flame reignited. So you can still leave your hot water on there, and you can still leave your cooked food on there if it's fully cooked. Even if these are coals of rotem wood, which was very, very strong. So like by reigniting those coals, it's as if it's a full force flame, and yet you're allowed to leave it there. Okay, so Shema Mina, what do you see from here? He doesn't make a distinction between food that is going to improve by being on the fire and food that's not going to improve. So apparently, even though the food is going to improve by being on there longer, we're still not worried that you're going to play with the coals.
So we can use the rotem?
We didn't get to an end yet. So Shani Hacha, well, you could use it, yeah, but you have to cover it. So Shani Hacha, de ketama. Again, that's a case you can't draw a broad conclusion from that case. You want to draw a conclusion. In other words, what's the Gemara's what is it attempting to prove? It's attempting to show that even according to the Chachamim, who say you can't leave food simmering over an open flame on Erev Shabbat, that maybe you should be able to leave a fully cooked food over the flame on Erev Shabbat. Since it's fully cooked, we're not worried you're going to stoke the coals. So that's what the Gemara is saying, that you see, that not just when it's mitzdamek viralo. If it's mitzdamek viralo, and it's fully cooked, even the Chachamim are going to allow you to leave it over the open flame, because you're not going to want to play with the flame. But if it's mitzdamek v'yafelo, if it's going to improve with the passage of time, that's what the Gemara is trying to say. Maybe the Chachamim will allow you, since it's fully cooked, Even though it's going to get better with time, they might allow you to leave it over an open flame. And that's why the Gemara keeps deflecting this and saying, you can't prove it, you can't prove it. So, if you're going to tell me that no, we can't prove anything from here, the only reason why Rabbi Yochanan is saying that you can leave a fully cooked food over the flame is because you covered it. And it reignited. Okay? Because it reignited. So, but then you have two different cases saying the same thing. Because you told me before that in the statement of, where we had this statement before, Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Nachmani, that the reason why he mentioned covering coals and then they reignite was to tell you that we treat it the same as covered. So too, you're telling me that that's what Rabbi Yochanan is trying to teach me. But Hainuhach, it's the same thing. So Gechalim Shel Rotem, it's Trichale, that the reason why you need it is because of Gechalim Shel Rotem. That here, the coals are so strong that the reigniting is like full force. And yet, he's still allowing you to leave food over the flame since you covered it. But over an open flame, even though you might argue that that's the equivalent of an open flame, you covered it, so you showed you don't want to play with those coals anymore. But over an open flame, he wouldn't allow you to do that. Especially not mitztamek v'yafelo. Even especially not a case where it's going to improve with the passage of time. So, Amar Rav Sheshet. Yeah.
How is covering the flame is as we have the power to warm up the food.
Right.
When you cover with ashes.
I guess it was still hot. It still must have been very hot. It still must have been very hot, yeah.
How effective?
Yeah, I guess the point of it was to discourage you from playing with it. Yeah. No, you're right. I don't know how hot it was. We were wondering that yesterday. I mean, I guess it must have been hot enough. They kept chamin over Shabbat. So.
I think the point is the dafina has to be fully cooked before Shabbat.
Well, then you have the issue of mitztamek v'yafelo, because the more you cook it, the better it is. So that's what we're going to see. We're going to see that. So Amar Rav Sheshet. Rav Sheshet says Amar Rabbi Yochanan. That Rabbi Yochanan said, "Kirash yisikol begefet b'aitim mashina le'achamin shelo huchamu kol tzorkan v'dav shelo bishel kol tzorko." This is a different opinion. This is the very moving away from what Rabbi Yochanan just seemed to have said. We have different versions of Rabbi Yochanan, because Rabbi Bar Chana said that Rabbi Yochanan said that you needed to cover the coals in order to leave food over it. Now Rav Sheshet is saying no. You can leave food over it, even water that's not fully cooked, and even food that's not fully cooked. You can leave it over an open flame. That's like what Hananya says. That's what Hananya was saying. Okay? However, akar, if you removed it, lo yachzir ad shigrof ad shitin efer. But if you remove it, you can only return it to a covered flame. That's like what Hananya says, not like the Chachamim. This version is saying that our Mishnah follows Chananya, that you can leave food over an open flame. Before, the statement of Rabbi Yochanan was following the Chachamim. But leaving something over, you don't need to have a covered flame, according to this version of Rabbi Yochanan. Amar Rava says, Tarvayu tanine. We learned both of these principles in a Mishnah already. Okay, and Rashi says, what does it mean, both of these? The idea that you can leave food over an open flame, we already learned. And the idea that you can't return food to a flame unless it's covered, we already learned. In other words, why is Rabbi Yochanan telling us this? We already know it. So, how so? Tanena. En notnin etapat betoch hatanurim chashecha v'lo charal al gabi gechalim ela kedei sheyikru paneha. That we learned in the Mishnah previously. It's actually in the first parak that you can't put bread inside the oven, and you can't put a cake on top of the coals unless they're going to be significantly cooked, unless they're going to have a crust before Shabbat starts. But the implication is you can leave it on there into Shabbat. It just has to be that there's a crust. Which shows you that you're allowed to leave it if it has developed a crust. You're allowed to leave it on there. So what you see is that even from our Mishnah, Beit Hillel is only saying you can return food to a covered flame. He's not saying you can return it to an uncovered flame. So basically the question is, why did Rav Sheshet report this in the name of Rabbi Yochanan? Both of these things are in the Mishnah. That you can leave food over an open flame, and that you can only return to a covered flame. So for Rav Sheshet, the reason why Rav Sheshet brought it was to show you that you can infer this from the Mishnah. that you can infer the support from the Mishnah. That's what how Tosafot interprets it. Rashi says that he wanted to show you that Mishnah that says that you can leave bread or you can leave a cake in the oven as long as it develops a crust is implying that you can leave something over an open flame into Shabbat. Okay, but either way you slice it, the point is that he knew that this was already implied in the Mishnah, and he just wanted to draw out that it's implied in the Mishnah. So now, Rav Sheshet, right? So Amar Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda, Amar Rav Yochanan. Here's another version of Rabbi Yochanan from Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda, saying in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, this time he says, if the flame is open, you can leave something that's fully cooked. So this is a third version. The first version of Rabbi Yochanan said that you had to cover the flame to put anything on it. The second version says you can leave something over it from before Shabbat, even if it's not fully cooked. This one's saying only if it's fully cooked. You can leave it over an open flame if it's fully cooked, even if it improves with time. Amar le'ahahu midrabanan. One of the rabbis, one of the students, said to Rav. Amar le'ahahu midrabanan. One of the rabbis said, LeRav Shmuel bar Yehuda. Said to Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda, Harav and Shmuel ta'amrei tarvayu mitztamek v'yafelo asur. Rav and Shmuel say that if the food is going to improve over time, it's not allowed. Now, again, we switched back. We keep going back and forth. We were in Hananya before, now we're following the Shitat Chachamim. We're following the position of the Chachamim, and we're saying that leaving food over an open flame shouldn't be allowed. But Rabbi Yochanan said in this version, not like Hananya. He said, he's saying like the Chachamim, that you can leave it over as long as it's fully cooked. The machloket is, Rabbi Yochanan said that even if it improves over time, as long as it's fully cooked, it's okay. And Rav and Shmuel said, no, if it improves over time, you can't leave it over an open flame. They're following the position of the Chachamim, that normally you can't leave food over an open flame. Hananya would say, as long as it's edible, you can leave it over an open flame into Shabbat. The Chachamim say, no, it has to be fully cooked. According to Rav and Shmuel, the Chachamim say, not only does it have to be fully cooked, but it has to get worse with time, so that way you won't be encouraged to play with the coals. Amar le, he said to them, so Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda said, so he says, Atu let ana yada. Are you thinking that I don't know? Okay, the Amar Rav Yosef, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel mitzamek v'yafalo asur. Because Rav Yehuda, in other words, Rav Yosef said that Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel said that if it improves with time, you can't leave it over an open flame. Ki kamena lach leRabbi Yochanan kamena. I was just telling you what Rabbi Yochanan said. In other words, this is a machloket. Even within the position of the Chachamim, there's a machloket. So Hananya would say, even if it's edible, you can leave it over the flame, no covering. But the Chachamim would say, you can leave it over the flame if it's fully cooked. Rabbi Yochanan says, any fully cooked thing can be left over the open flame. Rav and Shmuel say, only if it becomes worse with further cooking. Amar le Rav Ukva mi Meshan Rav Ashe. Rav Ukva from Meshan said to Rav Ashe, Atun de mekarvitu le Rav Shmuel avidu ke Rav Shmuel. Anan na'aved ke Rabbi Yochanan. Those people, you people, okay, he said to Rav Ashe, you people who are closer to the area of Rav and Shmuel should do like Rav and Shmuel, meaning you should only leave food over an open flame if it's fully cooked and it gets worse with time, like chicken or something like that will dry out. Okay, roast chicken. But we live near Rabbi Yochanan. We're going to follow Rabbi Yochanan. Amar le Abaye le Rav Yosef. Abaye said to Rav Yosef, Ma'ul lashot. What is the deal with leaving something over the flame, over an open flame on Shabbat? So again, we're asking again, do we follow Hananya or do we follow the Chachamim? Amar le, he said to him, Ha Rav Yehuda mashule v'achil. Rav Yehuda used to leave food over an open flame and eat it. So obviously you can. Amar le, he said to him, Bar minei de Rav Yehuda. Don't tell me Rav Yehuda. De kevan de misukanu. He has health problems. And he has life-threatening health problems. For him, you could probably heat something up even on Shabbat because, he's sick. Okay, but li velachmai, what about us? Amar le said to him, Besura mashu. In Surah, they left things over the open flame on Shabbat. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak marei de uvda hava, because Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak was very pious, umashule v'achil, and they would leave things over the open flame and he would eat it. So that shows you that he wasn't concerned. Amar Rav Asher says, Ka'imna kamed Rav Huna v'shahin lekasa dahar sena v'yachal v'lo yadana imishum dekasavar mitzamek v'yafel lo mutar imishum dekevan did be'micha mitzamek v'ralo. So Rav Asher says that I was in front of Rav Huna, and they used to leave over the open flame fish that was cooked in its own oil with flour. Some kind of fish concoction with fish oil, fish, and flour. And they would leave it over the open flame for him and he would eat it. And I don't know the reason why. Is it because he says that as long as something is fully cooked, you can leave it over the open flame? Or is it because he thought, in other words, even if it improves, it's okay? Or is it because this food becomes worse with time? And that's why he allowed it. Okay, so Amar Rav Nachman says, Mitztamek v'yafelo asur. That if the thing is going to become better with further cooking, you're not allowed to leave it over an open flame. Mitztamek v'ralo mutar. However, if it becomes worse, you're allowed to. Okay, so then he says, Klalal de milta. Here is the general principle. Kol de it b'micha.
How it will get worse?
Like, for example, let's say you have roast chicken. If you leave it for longer in the oven, it will get dried out. It will get ruined. Right? Certain things, if you stew them longer, the flavor, improves.
Better.
Right, but certain things, if you leave them for too long, right, mitzamek is dried out. So certain things, if they stew when their juice is longer, it's even better. Certain things, if they stew too long, it's overcooked. It's not good. Right? Yeah, chicken is a good example. Yeah. So that's why I'm using it. I'm thinking of the one that comes to mind. So he says, what's the general rule? Klalad de milta, kol de it b'micha mitzamek v'ralo. Anything that has flour in it is going to be bad if you leave it too long because it's going to absorb the liquid, basically. If it has flour, it's going to absorb the liquid. Levar mitavshil de lifta, unless it has turnips. Apparently the turnips will retain the moisture, the liquid in there, and it won't be ruined. Even though there is flour, if it has turnips, the turnips will offset the flour. As long as there's meat. So if you have meat and turnips, flour won't ruin it. Okay, but if you have turnips and flour alone, it still could ruin it. But if you don't have meat in there, then it's going to dry out. And even if it has meat and turnips and flour. Okay? That's only if you don't need it for guests. But if you need it for guests, then it's considered to be something that gets worse with further cooking. Now this is very interesting because that means that we don't just look at the quality of the food. We look at your use for the food. So since you're having a lot of guests, you don't want the meat to dry out. And even though the meat here is functioning to help the dish as a whole, since you're having a lot of guests, you don't want the pieces of meat to function like that. You want them to be nice and moist, so you have big pieces. So last part, lafda daisa v'tamrei mitzamek v'ralahen, that if you have lafda, which is anything that has figs in it. Daisa is anything that has like grain, a grain dish. It will get dried out. It will get ruined if you overcook it. It will get ruined. And tamra, yeah, it's some grits or some kind of any kind of or oatmeal or something like that. And tamre and dates, these things become ruined. If you overcook something with dates, it's going to be ruined. What's the halacha? So actually, the halacha, this is a machloket between the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramad. It's a machloket between the Rambam and the Tosafot. According to the Tosafot, we follow Hananiah's view that anything that is even partially cooked, as long as it's edible, you can leave it over an open flame into Shabbat. So even like so let's say you put the chamin a few hours before Shabbat, so it's at least partially cooked, it's at least half cooked. Let's say you can leave it into Shabbat. According to the Shulchan Aruch, according to the Rambam and Shulchan Aruch, the halacha is that we follow the Chachamim and we say that you can't leave anything over an open flame unless it's mitzdamek viralo, unless it's going to get worse with time. The only exception is if you put something totally raw up right before Shabbat. Then you're allowed to. So really that's a difference in minhag, that for Ashkenazim, they can put their chamin up early in the day on Friday, and as long as it's partially cooked, it's okay, they can leave it. For Sfaradim, really, they should put it right before Shabbat, because they want to start with something raw on Friday night, so they could say it's not edible yet, so we're leaving it and we're not going to touch it, and we're waiting till tomorrow to eat our chamin.